Right, it's 7 o'clock, so we'll make a start. Good evening and welcome. Welcome to West End, welcome to St James Primary School. Some housekeeping before we begin. We're not expecting the fire alarm to sound this evening. If it does, please leave the building through the fire exits, and we'll meet outside at the fire assembly point, which is the car park. We always welcome people to speak at the meeting, although this is a formal committee meeting of Eastleigh Borough Council and not a public meeting. The members of the public that have registered to speak will be invited to speak at the relevant agenda item and will be given a total of 3 minutes to speak. When the light is amber, you have 30 seconds remaining. People wishing to speak on an item on the agenda not on the agenda, are able to do so before we kick off in the public participation stage. And if you're speaking on an item on the agenda, then we'll do that before the debate commences. Once the debate has started, we can't accept any more comments from the floor. We want to be as inclusive as possible this evening, but we won't tolerate disruptions to our meeting. We do have the power under the Constitution to remove people from the meeting. Obviously, we don't want to do that, and I hope we won't have to. Councillors are reminded that to take part in this meeting, you must have an open mind, so you can take all the relevant considerations presented to the meeting into account in reaching your decision. By attending today, you've decided that you will be able to listen to all those points of view expressed by the speakers and the public, and you're able to participate and will not be seen to have predetermined the application. Councillors will be using tablet devices to access the agenda for the meeting, so they're not scrolling Facebook or playing Angry Birds. Anything like that. This meeting will be recorded and will be uploaded to the Council's website. If any members of the public prefer not to be recorded, then do please contact a member of staff. If you're planning on filming or recording the meeting, please do flag that with a member of staff so that they can ensure that you're not filming anyone who has asked and who has a right not to be filmed. And we do reserve the right to ask any filming that's considered intrusive to be stopped. And there's more information about that on the Council's website, if you wish. Item 1 on our agenda then is apologies, but I don't think we have any. We're all here. Item 2, declarations of interest. Members, do you have any declarations of interest that you wish to make? If so, could you indicate now? Councillor Marsh.
I'd like to declare 2 interests. Firstly, I'm the head teacher of the school, and because there's a school in this development, it could have a knock-on effect for this school for a catchment area. It's a non-pecuniary interest, though. But also I'd like to declare that I live in Burnett's Lane, so I live near the development. So again, it's a non-pecuniary interest, but I wanted for transparency to make that clear.
Thank you. Any more? I'm going to declare a similar interest to Councillor Marsh insofar as the school is concerned, because I'm the Chair of Governors, but again, non-pecuniary. No one else is waving, so we'll move straight on to item 3, public participation. And I'm going to first invite Kitty Budden, Lead Local Area Manager, to update the committee on the recent Cabinet decision regarding affordable housing.
Thank you, Chair. The Council's strategy for the provision of affordable housing was considered at Cabinet on the 15th of June. This brief report is to provide an update for councillors regarding the approved approach. It must be emphasised that this is being shared for information and is not a material planning consideration in relation to the planning applications being considered this evening. Councillors will be aware that the Council has an Eastleigh Homes delivery strategy, which sets out the direction of travel and aims for the Council's housing programme activity from 2021. The delivery strategy confirms the Council's aim to provide a more diverse supply of housing to borough residents and its ambition to become a landlord of choice across all types of tenure. As part of this aim, the Council is committed to delivering 35% affordable housing wherever possible on its own sites. In February 2021, Cabinet approved the Council reopening a housing revenue account as the financial and operational mechanism to support this. As the housing revenue account is recently established, there is no existing budget beyond the approved budget for the set-up costs or reserves to fund new properties. Due to the impact of increased costs in delivering new properties, in part due to increasing build costs and the impacts of costs around environmental mitigation, developers are finding it increasingly difficult to make schemes viable. If a scheme can be demonstrated to the satisfaction of the council as local planning authority not to be viable through the submission of a viability assessment, developers can seek to reduce the financial contributions and affordable housing provisions secured through the Section 106 agreement to improve viability and enable development to be delivered. There is a long-standing recognition from government that the delivery of affordable housing is challenging, and funding schemes exist for registered providers through one of Homes England's affordable housing programmes. Grants are typically not available to registered providers for purchasing affordable homes if they are secured through a Section 106 agreement, planning condition, or unilateral undertaking. For existing registered providers, these restrictions are not such a constraint, as they are able to use previous grants received to fund the purchase of additional units. The Council's housing revenue account does not have recycled grant to draw from. As developer, where it has been demonstrated that a development cannot provide a policy-compliant level of affordable housing and remain viable, the Council will seek to reduce the Section 106 agreement package of mitigation, which could include the reduction of provision of affordable housing. The Cabinet report considered last week sets out the Council's approach to affordable housing where it is developer. In brief, this is: an independent viability assessment will be commissioned to assess whether the development is commercially viable. If the development is found to be viable, affordable housing will be secured through the Section 106 agreement in accordance with the relevant adopted local plan policy. If the development is found to be unviable, the developer will agree with the local planning authority what is removed or reduced in the Section 106 mitigation package to enable the development to become viable. This may include reducing or removing the provision of affordable housing. The Council will then seek to deliver the equivalent of a policy-compliant level of affordable housing through one of Homes England's affordable housing programmes. Councillors should be aware that this grant funding is not guaranteed. As highlighted at the start of the report, I would like to remind the committee that the contents of this report is not a material planning consideration that can be given weight by the committee acting as local planning authority. Rather, it confirms the decision taken by Cabinet to find an alternative way of delivering affordable housing. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Kissy. And there is no further public participation here, although there is, of course, some when we get to some later agenda items. Item 4 then is the minutes. So we move to the minutes from the meeting held on the 26th of September 22. I was absent, so I'm going to abstain, and councillors who weren't members of the committee at the last meeting may wish to abstain as well. Could I have a proposer and a seconder that I approve these as a true record? Councillor Tennant and Councillor Broomfield. And do you have a comment, Councillor Broomfield?
I do. Just to prove that I've actually read the documents and to avoid any supposition that there might be predetermination. Item 4, to consider the minutes of the meeting held on the 26th of September 2023, it says here. Now, I don't know if we're going to be having a meeting on the 26th of September, but I really don't want to pay a hostage to fortune, so I just think you might want to change it.
Absolutely. Well noted. My script does say 22, so someone must have noticed at some point. Any more comments? No. All those in favour? Any abstentions? Lovely. Thank you, councillors. Item 5 on our agenda then is the planning guidelines. I'm going to ask Dawn Errington to please present those guidelines.
Thank you, Chair. Good evening, everyone. Yes, this item 5 is a general item. It gives general guidance on how planning applications should be considered. We give it to every committee that requires it, and it's also for the benefit of members of the public, just to confirm the procedure, really, for determining applications. So, first and foremost, the obvious proposals must be determined on planning grounds and only what's in front of the committee, so no sort of other ideas that committee might like but aren't part of the planning proposals. Very importantly, proposals should be determined in line with the development plan, unless material considerations indicate otherwise. That plan being the adopted Eastleigh Borough local plan, and also the Hampshire Minerals and Waste Plan, so that they combine to form the development plan. Other material considerations are detailed in the detailed committee reports, but just to summarise the main ones, the government guidance in the NPPF and its supporting practice guidance. There may be extant planning permissions for a site which are material considerations. The large sites are subject to environmental impact assessment, so that's material, as are habitat regulations requirements. They're all detailed in reports where necessary. Council's own supplementary planning documents on detailed matters, and obviously any consultation responses, labour responses, site-specific matters, and where relevant, appeal decisions and case law. That's the example of other things that you need to consider as well as the development plan. The national guidance has been with us a little while now. It was last updated in 2021. It's positive guidance for planning, supports sustainable development with the three strands of sustainability, that's economic, environmental and social. It specifically gives guidance on certain elements, including transport, that often comes up in planning applications, and the advice that that refusal should only take place if impacts are severe, rather than just concern. Designing for quality and beauty is in now in the guidance, but it also is very positive around delivering housing, making sure there's sufficient housing to provide for the future and making efficient use of land. Meeting challenges of climate change are within right through the document, as well as conserving and enhancing the natural environment. So there's various strands to it. It also does contain guidance on viability, which should be followed in those circumstances. In terms of decision making, the reports may weigh up issues in a planning balance. So it is very much for the committees to do that. The committee can delegate a decision to the Service Director for Planning and Environment if necessary, in consultation with the Chair and Vice Chair. That's normally where final information is outstanding. And where we do have EIA, there is a requirement post-decision here to refer applications to the Secretary of State to give further opportunity for call-in for public inquiry and to notify of decisions and reasons, and that is also covered in the report where necessary. In terms of process, then, we have an outline application on the agenda tonight. So that's very much the first stage of planning, and to achieve full planning permission for a development, you have to secure both outline and reserve matters approvals, which may come in phases. So there's a second stage. And there's also a third stage of conditions of discharge. So, there are various stages where we fine detail, we hone in on the fine detail, moving away from principles. Section 106 agreements for major developments may also be required with financial and non-financial obligations, and Hampshire County Council are normally a party to the Section 106 agreements. And those agreements can be varied. The Town and Country Planning Act allows that where there's agreement between parties, and again we've got a variation application on the agenda tonight. So that was a very brief summary, but hopefully sufficient to remind you of the processes and where these applications fit in them tonight. Thank you.
Lovely. Thank you, Dawn. And then we'll move swiftly on to item 6, which is the planning application for the land at Burnett's Lane, Berkeley Lane and Allenton Lane.
Mr. Chairman, before you do that, can I ask a question?
Yeah.
We've been told that the variation of a Section 106 agreement is not a material consideration because of the exclusion of social housing from, or effectively because at some point we're going to have to approve something without any social housing in it. It does seem to me a very odd conclusion. because we have in the outline application that we've already passed some months ago. Now, I don't know whether you want to, we agreed something subject to a Section 106 agreement which had social housing as part of its arrangements. Now, I entirely understand the Cabinet policy and the decision to provide social housing outside the Section 106 agreement. But the lack of housing in the Section 106 agreement does seem to be material to whether you give the permission or not.
I'm going to ask the planners.
Okay, so we've got two applications on the agenda tonight. One is considering whether to put affordable housing in the Section 106 agreement. So the Section 106 agreement hasn't been completed. The second application is in respect of an application that has a signed Section 106 agreement. The variation is the request is to take the affordable housing obligation out. You can consider that. It's a different consideration to the outline application, but clearly it's at this committee in order that you do consider the request to take affordable out.
So, in relation to item 7 on the agenda, everyone agrees that's material, indeed central. The deletion of the affordable housing
So the consideration
is a matter that should be considered.
The consideration as to whether affordable housing is in or out of the agreement is a material consideration. What isn't is the council strategy, alternative strategy for dealing with.
I understand that. I'm not challenging the strategy.
Yes. So we'll come to that in the agenda, but and I'll explain what factors you are considering. But yes, very much you can consider any changes to Section 106, and that's why the application is here. Yeah.
Yes, I'm not entirely convinced, because it seems to me even on the main application under item 6, the terms of the Section 106 agreement would be material.
They are, yes.
Yes, so the absence of social housing is material.
It's a material consideration,
Yeah.
yes.
Thank you.
Yes, yeah.
Super. Any more questions on that? No? Good. Now we go on to item 6 then, which is the planning application.
Thank you. Sorry, it's a very long description of an application, but that is the full description of the proposals. I'm not going to read it all out. I'm sure you've all had a chance to read it. I'll just pull out the highlights. I think the main point I'm going to make is that it's a phased development, and we've amended the description to make that clear following some recent case law. But it is a phased development that has separate phases for which combined would deliver up to 2,500 houses, a local centre, commercial floor space including retail, a primary school, public open space, allotments and other key infrastructure. Also in the description are the vehicle access points from Allington Lane, Fir Tree Lane and Burnet's Lane, so they're very specific details. And there is some demolition and site preparation work as well. All the other matters of detail are reserved, so the only matter for detailed consideration are those points of access. Thank you. So, where I'm going to start tonight is the September 21 committee resolution from this committee, because there was a long consideration and discussion around the application at that point, whereby the committee resolution was to support the application in principle, and then at that time delegate the final decision to the executive head for planning and economy, following receipt and consideration of outstanding matters, which at the time were some consultee responses, the completion of Habitats Regs appropriate assessment, completion of EIA work, completion of conditions, and completion of the Section 106 legal agreement. And the proviso was set that if we couldn't overcome the objection from two key consultees, which were Hampshire Highways and Natural England, that the application would come back to committee. So that was the resolution. That was obviously a few months ago. In that interim period, there's been an awful lot of work done to address those outstanding matters, not least the highway works and the appropriate assessment, which is needed under the habitat regulations. So the report outlines the key changes since September 21. So I'm pleased to be able to report that, as I said, following a lot of work with the applicant's team and Hampshire Highways, we have no objection from Hampshire Highways. That's obviously subject to various Section 106 terms. Slightly less positive, although we managed to address a lot of Natural England's long list of concerns, they have an objection remaining primarily relating to recreational impacts on the New Forest. But as a competent authority, Eastleigh Council has concluded the habitat regulations appropriate assessment, and that's where Natural England has considered it. But as competent body, that's us, not Natural England, we have concluded that there would be no adverse significant effects on international designated sites that are protected for ecological reasons, and that has been a very thorough and detailed assessment with quite considerable additional information provided by the applicants. In this passage of time, the borough local plan has been adopted, so you'll see any reference to previous versions of the plan removed from the current version of the report. Makes it much more straightforward in terms of your consideration, in terms of compliance with the local plan. It's an allocated site and no longer a countryside site in the local plan. So that's quite an important policy change. We've had minor plan updates which are detailed in the reports to just be largely consistent with the detailed applications which have been granted in that interim period for both the link road that runs from Burnet's Lane to Allington Lane, which is under construction now, and the first residential parcel. So the planning history has been updated in the report. And also, as we've already touched on, that we have received an independent viability review for the site, which recommends the removal of affordable housing in the Section 106 list of obligations. And then finally, the report has been updated in terms of environmental impact, conclusions, reasons for granting permission. So the report is also the Council's environmental impact assessment. Hence, it's quite long and it's quite detailed in some respects because it has to cover that legislation as well. So just moving a slight step back, I think just to remind members about the site. I know a lot of you are very familiar with it, but just to remind you, it's a 125 hectare site in terms of the application site. So a large site with various constraints and opportunities, which I've listed the summary of them on the screen. There is obviously existing roads, and as I've already said, accesses are proposed from Burnet's Lane, Allington Lane and Fir Tree Lane. There are a number of public rights-of-way which cross both east-west and north-south the site, all of which would need upgrading. There are watercourses which you can see on the blue lines which cross the site and also run north-south next to the site, one of which is a main river. Largely adjoining those are sort of woodland and ecological areas, some of which are designated as sites of important for nature conservation. They're largely outside the site and also include a sink down at the bottom here at Chalcroft Business Park. I'm sure you're familiar with the site, but there are largely the field boundaries, are hedged, so there are hedges crossing the site, some of which may be removed and be replaced. There's a listed building here at Fir Tree Farmhouse, so that's something that an opportunity under constraint, I suppose, in terms that the scheme needs to respond to. There are residential neighbours largely on the eastern side here, one here as well. And just to point out the obvious, this hole in the middle is the solar farm, which isn't part of the application site, but remains on the site. So the development surrounds it. So in terms of plans for approval for an outline application, it's not usually that many because it is, the principle of the development largely that's being considered. But we do have applications normally accompanied by parameter plans, and we have 4 for this application to be considered. So these ones are for approval. They very much move on from those constraints and opportunities and set, again, broad brush principles really, or parameters. So this one is the land use, and as you can see, so in the orange is residential, the pink is mixed uses, including commercial, including the local centre here, and commercial uses down at the southern end of the site next to Chalcroft Business Park. The green is green infrastructure and sports, the dark green being an all-weather pitch. And then in here, just above it to the north, is the school. So, again, really sort of high-level plans, but nevertheless setting the parameters of land use. The next one is the green infrastructure plan. So, again, everything green, amenity space and play, sustainable drainage, which is actually shown blue here, ecological and biodiversity net gain areas and buffers for those sinks and any ancient woodland. Allotments, 2 areas of allotments are shown here, and then the sports pitches I've referred to. The third parameter plan is for access. So again, it's the 3 points of access that I've referred to, and also the principal link road access is shown on this plan. The one that's has detailed permission is under construction. And then finally, the plan for approval is, last parameter plan for approval is building heights. Now these are maximums, and by no means the whole of these areas shown would be at those maximum heights. May just be the key taller buildings, landmark buildings, but they range from 2 to 4 stories. So for example here, that's 2-storey residential edge, moving to 3, then up to 4. The 6-storey buildings were removed from the southern and northern gateways following public consultation. And but we do have a potential taller building in the local centre shown. Yes, and obviously adjusting for the listed building and adjacent properties when necessary. But they are high-level plans. What this application doesn't propose, and not for approval, are the reserved matters, the other reserved matters, so that they would come later. So for each phase, that would be layout, scale, appearance, and landscaping. So there aren't details, and this isn't the time to be setting those details. That's at the next stage. What the plans do combine to do is help form an indicative master plan, which we have here. So again, it's those land uses that are in the description, I've talked about, but shown all together on the plan. So I've referred to where the local centre is, the primary school, and then employment, sports pitches, and open space throughout the site with a destination play next to the local centre, drainage throughout the site, hedges and woodland trees, watercourses and buffers all shown and included in that master plan, public rights of way retained and enhanced. It is an indicative plan. Obviously, it's a long project. Things may adjust, but we have, under Condition 6, required broad compliance with that plan, so there is some degree of certainty as to how the scheme will pull together in the long term. Similarly, we have a draft design code, which is being progressed, and that will home in on the detail. So to make sure there's consistent and unifying standards and quality throughout the site. It'll be quite an exciting document when we see the next versions of it. That will be finalised, considered and finalised during the first reserve matters, and again, Condition 8 requires that. So that will include the various residential phases as well as the mixed uses. and will put a lot more meat to the bones in terms of what you would expect to see, and certainly the quality of the development throughout the site. It's a really important document, very much encouraged by government now to have those documents in place for sites. And then just the last plan I'm going to show you is the illustrative phasing plan, because, and I'm sorry, you can't see all the phases on the plan, I'll just point them out, but again, it's a really important document because it tells us how the site's going to proceed. The phases won't come one at a time, they'll be very much concurrent over a 10 to 12 year period. But for example, the first phase, which was a green space off Allington Lane, is already delivered. The link road second phase is under construction. The third phase down here for the first residential parcel is about to start, and then the fourth phase, which will be the second residential phase, would be up here in Poverty Breach. It includes the whole site, so everything's included in a phase, whether it's green space, allotments, or any sort of drainage works. Everything is included, so that it will, we will see how the whole site is going to be phased. So again, condition 5 requires sort of that plan, broad, compliance with that plan, accepting that things may change over time, but we will see those changes. So moving on to the report itself, yes, I mean, quite a lot of key considerations, a lot of, other minor ones as well, but just pulling out the key ones. Environmental impact, as I've said, is very important, in terms of legislation, and we're very much towards the end of that process now, but it does, it's a lot of information and a lot of work goes into that, and the report covers it as necessary. As I've said, the development principle and the housing density and the design approach were supported back in September, and much of the more recent work has been around infrastructure and traffic and highways, so that's been updated. Water management and flooding, there hasn't really been any change in the documentation, no change in consultation responses in respect of that. But ecology has been updated. Residential community, again, no obvious change in circumstances in relation to neighbours, but very much an update in terms of affordable housing and viability in the report. So section 106 and conditions have been updated, and conditions completely finalised now, subject to any amendments today. And the planning balance at the end of the report has also been updated. So just moving back to the principle of development, as I said, was supported back in September 21. The resolution recognised that the site already has planning permission for 1,404 dwellings, part of which has been implemented with the road works that have happened. Site's already allocated, so obviously in the adopted plan now under policy HH1. That policy doesn't allow for the full 2,500 houses of this current application, but I think, as I explained last time at committee, the background work, working on a density of 40 dwellings per hectare, and losing the site for the secondary school, which was originally in the original permissions, does enable that number to be achieved. And that is a significant, very significant contribution towards the borough's supply for housing land. So that shouldn't be underestimated. The 40 DPH does give an efficient use of land, which is what the MPPF seek, and also it clearly avoids other countryside sites having to be allocated to get to those housing numbers. So it's a conscious approach to design to do that. There are other uses other than residential. So there is employment in accordance with policy, and other community uses, retail uses, which will make the site sustainable in its own right. And there is a strong open space strategy as well. So yes, I mean all those matters were considered, and then haven't really changed since September 21. Nor has the housing design approach, but it's worth just reminding you that it is very much a placemaking approach. It's, it's not trying to repeat the suburbs of Horton Heath. It's trying to, deliver a new community in a new way and making a new place. And all the supporting documents are focused on that. But the design code, I've said, is key. There's a few things that I just need to point out. So whilst the scheme does provide for 275 later living units or elderly persons accommodation, it doesn't fully meet our higher access standards set down in our adopted policy now, policy DM29, and that's the higher end of accessibility provisions for wheelchair provision across general housing units. But they are larger than normal units, which would give the flexibility for adaptation if needed. So just now moving on to some of the key issues that have been worked on in the last year and a half. Infrastructure comes up, obviously, in a lot of comment on the application, quite rightly. You can't have the housing and the employment without supporting infrastructure. So there's, as I've said, there's been a lot of work that's been done on transport, but there's also provision either on-site or through Section 106 contributions off-site for other key infrastructure, education particularly, health, sports and community facilities, open space with commuted sums, which aren't cheap, public art and community worker. So they're all essential infrastructure that have been requested and provided for both through conditions in Section 106. And those we expect to provide wider benefits for the wider community as well as the new development itself. Just homing in on traffic, because that has obviously a large proportion of objection that we have, and comment is around traffic and highways, quite understandably. So it has needed comprehensive mitigation, a lot of discussion with Hampshire Highways. As I've said now, they have no objection, subject to that sort of suite of mitigation. That's all listed in the report. There are extensive highway works required off-site. Just worth pointing out that I think last time we were at committee, we didn't have resolved an issue around Blackberry Drive. That has now been addressed. There are no, Blackberry Drive is not to be relocated. It remains as existing. And Hampshire, took those comments on board, and as did the applicants. And yeah, so those plans are now more acceptable. The off-site highway works plans are Section 106 agreement requirements, but they are very much delivered through the Section 278 process rather than the planning application process. But we have put them on the application file and they are available for viewing. Just a little update in terms of transport. I think in paragraph 215 we weren't clear whether improvements were required to junction 11 of the M3, so that's north of the site, and National Highways have confirmed that's not required. There are also significant to sustainable transport provisions, so it's not just about delivering improvements for car users, it's very much trying to deliver a sustainable approach and to encourage residents to use other modes of transport. So extensive cycle routes been required through the Section 106 provision and on site, and then other traffic mitigation measures sort of linking to Hedgeham Railway Station and providing for buses, electric vehicles, travel plans. So yeah, there is a whole range of traffic mitigation proposed. Moving on to sort of another key consideration, which was considered last time at committee, but I thought worth reminding where we were at. So surface water management and flood risk is an issue. The development, so the plan in front of you is, the map in front of you is the Environment Agency's flood map, and the blue areas are the areas of flood risk, flood zones. so the development isn't in those areas of flood risk, other than where road bridges need to cross streams, which clearly they must do. This was very much considered and assessed with the Link Road application, which has since been approved, and with the support of the Environment Agency and also Hampshire as lead local flood authority. But one of the key points that I would make in terms of the development is that greenfield runoff rates must be delivered. There is no, there's no alternative. You have to deliver surface water management on site to ensure that greenfield runoff rates don't change. There has already been flood risk assessment and drainage plans checked. They will check again and again, so they will be checked again by the statutory consultees at reserve matter stage and at condition discharge stage. So the condition that we put on is condition 24 for final SUDS, sustainable drainage plans per phase. That condition is a combination of consultee responses, so it's various consultees asking for different elements for drainage, all combined into that condition. I think in response to some comments we've received today about sort of concerns that they may not be checked and they might be built but not checked, I am recommending that that condition is amended slightly. So at the end of the condition, we have a requirement that the sustainable drainage system shall be implemented, verified as correctly installed, so that's the addition, and thereafter managed and maintained in accordance with approved details. So hopefully members will support that and agree that that's a good mechanism to make sure that the checks and measures are in place. So moving on to sort of another key issue, ecology. So again, as I've said, a lot of work been done on ecology in recent months. Again, a positive to bring to your attention is that 10% biodiversity net gain will be delivered on the site, across the site, and that's a real positive, and will be in line with new government legislation coming in this year. There is extensive ecology already on the site and adjoining the site, which is largely retained, just a few sort of hedges and trees to be removed to allow for roads, which would be replaced. So it's already in a good position in terms of ecology, but it will be made much better with biodiversity net gain. Other ecological considerations relate to sort of off-site matters, so it's these internationally designated sites. So the site drains into the River Itchen, itself internationally protected, which then drains into the Solent, also protected. So that's water quality and water flow, has had a lot of consideration to make sure sediments, nutrients and other matter don't pollute the rivers and the waters. There's also recreational impacts from potential recreational impacts from the development. So residents from the development going to both the Solent waterfront and New Forest. And the impacts that are raised by natural England are largely relate to dogs. So dog walking, dogs disturbing nesting birds. So that's the impact that's been raised, and so our job is to find solutions to that. There's already an established solution for Solent. It's a project that is run wardening and other things down across along the Solent protected areas. So the development where it is in the catchment for that will pay contributions into that. For New Forest, it's a relatively new issue. The mitigation solution for the Eastleigh have concluded is to provide mitigation, so prevention really, to stop residents going to New Forest in the first place, which is Natural England's first choice, obviously. So SANG, so that's suitable alternative natural green space being provided at both Itchen Valley Country Park, so additional country park capacity to meet the needs of this site. And then there's other sang for other developments in the borough. On top of that, it's accepted that some residents will still travel to the New Forest. Contributions towards wardening in the New Forest itself, as well as monitoring and reviewing the strategy. Unfortunately, Natural England, although they support the principle of having Itchen Valley Country Park as a mitigation for this site, they want sort of more mitigation in terms of land area than Eastleigh think is reasonable and or supported by evidence. And they also want more certainty around delivery, albeit that the project has planning permission and has started. We're not in full agreement with Natural England about that New Forest solution, but as the council, as competent authority, has reached its own conclusions on, good evidence that it considers that the impacts on the New Forest would not be significant, particularly given the long travel distance by car from the site to the New Forest. The Natural England use a straight line drawn across the Solent, which clearly can't be the normal travel for residents of the site. So that's where we've got to. We're happy as competent authority. We've done an awful lot of work on that. It's been through cabinet, that strategy, a couple of times. That it is, is the best solution to meet that alleged impact. So there are lots of conditions and Section 106 obligations as a result of all that in terms of ecology, all of which have been agreed with the applicants. Sorry, then just moving on to another key issue, which I know may get raised, in terms of residential amenity. Details of housing, location, design, impact is very much a detailed matter for reserve matters, and I know that's quite difficult at this stage, but it does need that proper site assessment at that time with draft plans and consideration to get the right scheme, because there may be many options for that. So the advice is that we recognise that, particularly at Barley Fields, there are relationships with neighbours that will need to be considered, and very much want to work with those residents and getting the best scheme at the right time for that. Other comments that came up were around impacts from highway works, which were passed on to Hampshire. There were comments around the 6-storey buildings on the site edges at the gateways, which have now, the 6-storey building was reduced to 4-storey, and there were comments around sports pitch uses. It's all covered in detail in the report. And then finally, the key issue that we've already mentioned around viability and affordable housing. So this is a recent independent assessment that has been done for viability. It needs to be up to date. We couldn't have one that was out of date. It's a, we've had a very thorough, robust viability done, which we're experienced in dealing with this issue and are happy that it's, the conclusions and the figures are correct. Unfortunately, the current climate with very high rising, obviously cost of living, we know about this, high rising costs, as well as new costs which weren't considered in the local plan viability review. Inflationary pressures have all, falling house prices, all wouldn't, it doesn't surprise us that the conclusion is that there is a shortfall in between costs and revenue. So it's quite significant, and the government advice is that you do look at affordable, and you deliver it where you can. But if it genuinely cannot be provided, the advice is that you still need to deliver housing, even if it's not affordable housing, secured through Section 106. It's still delivering housing. So the advice to you, and again there are some figures in the report, is that for the development to proceed and keep that delivery, keep the housing supply for the borough, not run the risk of having other sites come forward because we haven't got 5 years supply, is to accept that viability review, which recommends taking affordable out of the list of Section 106 obligations. So yes, the government advice is yes, you shouldn't refuse permission if it genuinely cannot be provided. As Kitty mentioned, and I will say it briefly, but I will say it again, not a material planning consideration. Do not put weight on this, but you're aware of the council strategy to seek to secure grant funding. So just to make that point, that because it can't be in Section 106 or condition, it is not something that you can put weight on. The lack of affordable is considered in the planning balance, and that planning balance, does tilt, slightly more against it, but it's a fair and open assessment of that issue. So moving on to other Section 106, I think it's important to say that some sites are so unviable that other things fall away, and it's been really important to hold on to those because they are so important to deliver a high quality scheme, meet the long-term needs of the development and the wider community. So all the other obligations are included there. Again, not cheap, but there's a comprehensive package of Section 106 obligations that remain, as well as the 275 later living units. The Section 106 also includes things like phasing and monitoring funding to ensure that everything is checked as the development goes along, and that's also an environmental EIA requirement. Okay, so that's Section 106. There are conditions as well, fully listed in the report. So just coming back to where you need to be in terms of your material considerations. So it's those things that are on the screen, plus others in the report, but those are the main ones. There's a lot to consider. We pull it together in the planning balance at the end, and I've mentioned that a couple of times. There are positives and negatives, and obviously as a committee you can form your own view on those and what weight you want to put on them. We've given advice on that. Overall, the advice to you is that it's weighs in favour of supporting the development, providing all that mitigation is delivered as required in the details, conditions in Section 106. Then just to briefly touch on the processes. So yeah, so in terms of environmental impact assessment, we've a couple of times already informed the Secretary of State of the proposals. Since when it first came in, the end of 2020, we've had notifications. We've told the Secretary of State that Eastleigh are the applicants. I know there's been some concern raised about Eastleigh are, the council is the applicant and the local planning authority. That is entirely normal situation. It's normal across the country. That is very much the situation with councils as developer as well as local planning authority, who are well able to separate the issues. But we have given the opportunity for the Secretary of State to call it in for public inquiry to make the decision, take it out of Eastleigh's hands. They haven't chosen to do that. We will do another notification. We have to, at the end of the process, informing them of the decision. But, government policy is pro-housing, so, you wouldn't necessarily expect it to be called in, certainly not because the council are applicants. The EIA conclusions and reasons to grant are in the report, so we just topped and tailed that in terms of everything we have to do under EIA, and the appropriate assessment habitat regs is largely repeated in the report, so you've got everything under all the regulations and legislation in one report. So yeah, just to finish, so the conclusion recommendation, we are, as officers, happy to advise that it would be a sustainable development, on all those three strands of development. So it's not just, one; it's a combination of all of them, to gives it that positive planning balance. So it's a fairly clear recommendation now, grant outline permission subject to recommended conditions, and that's with the update to condition 24 on SUDS that I put to you tonight. Completion of the Section 106 legal agreement and completion of the EIA notification processes. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Dawn. I'm going to check at this point if anyone wants a short break. And Councillor Marsh is nodding, so we'll take a 2-minute break. Thank you. So we'll go to public participation on this item. So I have a few members of the public registered to speak, and then we have a few written statements that we'll go through. Can I ask Peter Grant on behalf of Barleyfields Residents Group to come and speak? You get 3 minutes, so I'm going to press the 3 minutes button, and when this goes yellow, you have 30 seconds left.
Right, okay. Well, thank you for the opportunity to speak on behalf of Barleyfields Resident Group. We consider the proposed design set out in the outline application does not yet sufficiently or reasonably consider the true impact on this community. For this reason, Barleyfields Residents Group object to the planning application. Barleyfields comprises of 8 houses and is unique as the only community with a boundary on 2 sides with a development site. This boundary is only defined by a thin hedgerow, drainage ditch, and in places just a barbed wire fence. BFRG, for short, have raised concerns in writing via letters in March 21 and in July 21. In addition, we've had several meetings with representatives of the One Horton Heath project team, planners and councillors. Everyone we've spoken with seems to understand our unique position and have been sympathetic, but as yet, no one has been able to make commitments to address them. The explanation being offered is this will be dealt with later, but will it? I will summarise these issues. Firstly, scheme design. We note the planning report has summarised our key concerns in section 65, those raised by BLRA in section 70, and indeed highlighted by the Fair Oak Horton Heath Parish Council in section 89. Fair Oak and Horton Heath Parish Council reiterated that there needs to be thick screening, planting to protect the amenity and privacy of residents, and that further work is required. We have met with the project team to address this issue, but feel we're being kept at arm's length in relation to options. We thought our concerns had been heard and indeed supported. Some recent indicative design drawings, e.g. the secondary link road, appeared to indicate some protective zoning could be delivered. However, none of this is fixed or included as part of this outline planning application or the design code. Indeed, scope to do so will be limited if the green infrastructure perimeter plan is approved. Given there appears to be general acceptance of the need to provide substantial greening to this boundary, we believe this should be conditioned as part of any approval. The committee should stipulate the submission of a landscape design, agree with BFRG for this boundary within, say, 6 months of outline planning consent being granted. Our second concern relates to the uncertainty. This community has been blighted by uncertainty resulting in difficulties in selling any of the houses. This arises due to a lack of clarity over how close new houses may be to this fragile boundary, the height of such houses, and extent of any landscaping. Prospective purchasers are not surprisingly deterred by the uncertainty. The consequence of this uncertainty is to put people's lives on hold. Imagine if you are unable to move house for any reason, which could include moving to another area to take up a job or to downsize, potentially for 10 years or more. This committee could resolve this by making it a condition of the outline consent that a minimum 50-metre landscape zone should apply to the sensitive boundary and limit the height of houses to 2.5 stories. They should also require that any such agreed plantings should be implemented before the construction of any houses,
Could you draw
enabling
your
trees
remarks to a
to
close?
mature. 10 seconds. We respectively ask the committee to be proactive in protecting residents' well-being and being more directive and make a resolution of this key boundary a condition of the anticipated planning approval. Thank you.
Thank you. Next person registered to speak is Councillor Louise Parker-Jones.
Thank you. It knew I was coming, and it knows I like to talk. Members, I am disappointed to have to stand before you this evening and urge you to reject this application. Eastleigh Borough Council had the opportunity to act responsibly and not ride roughshod over our existing communities and our natural environment. Eastleigh Borough Council had the opportunity to demonstrate to some of our more challenging developers who failed to deliver what they was promised and to show them how it could be done and to deliver properly. Instead, I am concerned and alarmed that many of our own policies are being directly ignored to the detriment of local people. Firstly, I draw your attention to our adopted local plan, DM28. This application will not deliver our required affordable housing, 35%. And worse still, it makes no provision, not one house in the 2,500 properties during a cost of living crisis and mortgages which are unaffordable to so many. Our policies D5 and D6 both deal with water and flood management, yet so many things are yet to still be taken into account. There have been incidences of flooding along Allington Lane, and there are more concerns from residents that things that have been put into place have not been fit for purpose. Paragraph 6.151 is an absolute contradiction, stating that the Habitats regulation is capable of being delivered without adverse impact, yet in the same breath using lots of maybes and coulds and shoulds. I'd also really like to know where these additional sangs are within our borough. We cannot mitigate out of harm, and the Itchen is a nationally important, well, world-renowned site. If an authority, in fact the national authority on such matters, Natural England, holds an objection, how can we say we are more professional and more qualified to take that decision? We are in the midst of a climate and environmental emergency. The DM29, which is about, has not been met. Paragraph 100, Hampshire County Council's Mineral and Waste, highlight how disappointed they are that mineral safeguarding advice has been ignored. There are further conflicts with our policies, such as the M23 for self-builds. Should I go on with the plethora of problems of ifs and maybes? Funding towards Chicken Hall Roundabout, which we now know is not going to exist because they're putting in traffic lights. Why are these things still within the document? How congested will Alan Drayton Way become? There is no provision to address this for the residents of Fair Oak and Bishopstoke. If members, we cannot hold ourselves to such standards, then how many other applications will come forward, failing residents and failing nature? Has Eastleigh Borough Council finally gone the whole way to being merely a developer who happens to perhaps provide some council services? How can we not expect in the next 6 months
Could you draw your remarks to
Section
close,
106 will come back and ask you to overturn all the decent things that might be in it? I urge you, reject this current application as it stands. Thank you.
Thank you, Lou. And now, Councillor Gin Tidridge, please.
Thank you, and thank you for allowing me to speak tonight. I find it very strange that the Horton Heath development has several neighbours, including Bishopstoke, and yet Bishopstoke councillors do not sit on this committee. And we've already raised many implications from this development on the people of Bishopstoke who do not have representation in this committee, which I find disappointing. I don't envy the members tonight. I think you have a difficult decision. It's difficult when you act as developer and you act as the planning permission considerer. I'm sorry, there's a better word than that. It's difficult to remain independent when you have all those things to consider. And I'm sure that, like me, you've gone through the documents attached to this very closely. The document I found particularly interesting was the viability assessment. And I would draw members' attention to page 65 of the viability assessment, which was conducted independently, which considers the affordable housing option from a financial perspective. It models just two options, the full 35% and zero, nothing in between. There's no threshold shown between those two areas. Perhaps there is a level of affordable housing that could have been considered, but no, the viability report only looked at the full 35% and zero. Affordable housing is so important. We know that it really matters to local people who want to be able to stay in the area. This is not a cheap area to live in. And we want to be in a position where our friends, our family can continue to live here. And so it's really important. So on page 65 of the viability assessment, it models two scenarios. One includes the Part 4 M3 building regulations that relate to accessibility, and one excludes. The one that includes it concludes that both 35% and 0% both result in a non-viable development. So basically, you have to consider scrapping the Part M43 building regulations policy consideration if you're to achieve viability for this site. Profit with 35% in both scenarios, A and B, is 146.5 million, giving a residual land value of minus 37.0 million. For the 0% affordable housing is 196.5 million, giving a residual land value of 71.3 million. If the Part M43 building regs thing is scrapped, then the residual land values for with 35% go to minus 26.4, and with 0% go to plus 80.5. I just think it's worth highlighting that affordable housing really important, accessible housing really important. I'm also really disappointed that the report doesn't actually include that
Could you
that
draw
Part
your remarks to a
M43
close?
building regulations factor into the equalities statement. Because I would have thought that given the content of paragraph 156, it should be there. There was also no assessment of the impact on climate change and environmental considerations, despite that being something that full council passed as an Eastleigh Borough Council wider policy a few years ago. So I urge members to be critical of this report. Thank you.
Thank you, Jim. That's the speakers we have. Can I just ask the officers if they want to come back on any of those points?
Yeah, I will just come back on, I think, yeah, I will. In terms of the barley fields, yeah, I fully acknowledge and recognise the concerns that we can't pin details down now, but very much it is, details. I've said the reserve matters that deal with layout, appearance, landscaping. That is where those matters are properly considered and will be considered at that point. But what you don't want, excuse me.
Sorry, we can't just have a free-for-all.
Yeah, what you don't want to do is to prejudge that and to make the wrong decision on things. And we, from experience, I would say you do have to wait and look at every factor, including site survey information, which we don't have at the moment, and further assessment in terms of neighbour considerations at that time. So I'm optimistic that you won't have to wait too long for that process to start. It's the third residential phase in that phasing programme, so we would expect to start the applicants and ourselves to start with that pre-application engagement later this year or early next year, looking at the phasing programme. Mr. Payne will correct me if I'm wrong on that. In terms, I think in terms of Councillor Parker-Jones, I think everything is addressed in the report. I think just pulling out some of the negative things. There are an awful lot of positives in that report, not least that there is 10% biodiversity net gain delivered, which isn't currently a legal requirement. And so that hopefully will give some assurances, which obviously contributes not only to the ecology, but also to climate change. So as comment in terms of the viability report, yes, those figures were correct that were quoted. One thing I would point out in terms of this comment about climate change, and what the if reading the report, which you clearly have done, then you will have seen that in terms of climate change and future home standards, which building regs introduced in 2025, then that adds an additional cost of £7,500 per dwelling. So that is clearly impacting viability. So it is providing for that, but at cost. But that will be a mandatory requirement at that time. And obviously, this is a long-term project, and that has been picked up. We did very much consider both. We had lots of discussion with the assessors and with the applicants around M43 and the costs for that. but also whether there should be whether there could be a level of affordable housing. And we had lots of discussion around that, but I have to say the conclusion was that wasn't possible. The affordable housing is almost as much as all the other obligations combined. It is very expensive, but we did look at that, and the applicants can endorse what I'm saying is that we had a number of meetings discussing whether it was possible to have a reduced level, and that's obviously government guidance says that, but the figures do speak for themselves as you have seen. Thank you.
Thank you, Dawn. We now have some written questions and statements which I'm going to ask Kitty to read out.
Thank you, Chair. So to begin with, we have a written question from Councillor Karen Cause. She says, given that modern building techniques exclude all cavity nesting birds, many of which are red listed, can the committee please confirm that universal nesting bricks, otherwise known as Swift bricks, will be installed in all buildings in the One Horton Heath development according to the British standard BS 42021 2022 integral nest boxes? Would you like me to carry on with the next statement, Chair?
I think we have responses to the ones that were done in advance, so we may as well do them while everyone remembers the question. So I will ask Dawn to explain that one.
Okay, so nesting birds are sort of one of the sort of many ecological considerations that will come into play when looking at biodiversity net gain. So I think it's, yes, we will look at it for each phase. It depends on, as I understand it, on orientation and design, so whether you can or can't do it in buildings in that phase. Condition 75 does require that net gain, and it will be considered as one of the many ecological benefits at each phase. Thank you.
Thank you. Could you read the next one?
The next statement is from Keir Wingrove. He says, I am writing to object to the above planning application number 0/20/89498 that will be considered at the local area committee tomorrow, as in tonight, Thursday the 22nd of June 2023. I am objecting on behalf of myself, Keir Wingrove, freehold owner of 2 and 3 The Granary, Allington Lane, Kathleen Dickens, freehold owner of 1 The Granary, Allington Lane, and Janice Combs, freehold owner of Willow Barn, Allington Lane. The basis of our objection is that we have no confidence that EBC, Eastleigh Borough Council, can professionally separate their responsibilities as the developer and as the planning authority, and that One Horton Heath development should not progress until this situation is remedied. This is based on their performance to date in designing, approving and building the first phase of the One Horton Heath development, namely the roundabout on Allington Lane and its associated road and drainage works. These encompass the design being incorrectly approved by EBC planning in that it failed to meet the planning conditions, i.e. no allowance for exceedance events. The EBC approved contractor implementing the attenuation system has not even built it in line with the approved design, i.e. no allowance for exceedance events, and the pond has inadequate capacity. And the completed attenuation system has supposedly been surveyed successfully by a representative of the Chief Engineer from Hampshire County Council and a completion certificate issued. However, this survey has been demonstrated to be less than perfect, as the flow regulating valve has subsequently been proved to have not been set to operate at all, thus rendering the system inoperative. And no evidence has been provided to show this survey actually took place. Within a fortnight of this survey and the completion certificates, property, Willow Barn and the Granny Flats, downstream of the attenuation system, suffered a major flood, the first one in living memory on all those sites. Despite highlighting the errors consistently after the flood to EBC and HCC, the flow regulating valve wasn't put into operation for months, and to date, no remedial work has been done to rectify the faults nearly 2 years later. This has led the owners of the affected property being in constant fear of flooding since this first phase of works have been completed on 1 Horton Heath on the 5th of July 2021 when the certificate of completion was signed. So my question is how you'll resolve this conflict in interests.
And I think Helen will come in on this one.
Thank you, Councillor Goma. Yes, Eastleigh Borough Council's position is that the arrangements at Allington Lane are entirely satisfactory and there have been no further flood events following the event detailed by Mr Wingrove. I can also reiterate that his statement relates to previously implemented works, and all the works within the outline planning application being considered at committee tonight will have to be approved by the relevant statutory consultees. The planning authority functions are undertaken by council teams who work separately from the 1 Horton Heath development team, and the officers in those teams are mindful of their legal and professional obligations to approach this like any other planning application. Furthermore, the application is reviewed by a range of statutory consultees, including the Environment Agency and Hampshire County Council, who have raised no objection on flooding grounds and who will remain involved in approving technical details during each phase of the development. Thanks.
Thank you, Helen. I think we have one more statement for now.
Thank you. The final statement is from David Lang. The need for subsidised housing provision has long been recognised. The cost of private sector housing that meets acceptable standards, compared with the level and distribution of incomes and assets, means significant numbers of households lack the resources to make a demand for decent housing effective in the market. Without subsidised housing, these households may fail to obtain housing of a decent standard. The NPPF says where major development includes the provision of housing, at least 10% of the housing provided should be for affordable home ownership, subject to some exceptions. There is no minimum level of provision of affordable rented housing. This is for local planning authorities to determine. Catch 22. Government official Sir Michael Lyons says, "We would stress that it is not just the number built, but also the balance of tenures and affordability which need to be thought through for an effective housing strategy." Home ownership has been difficult to access in recent years, particularly for first-time buyers, while access to social housing is constrained by limited supply. The private rental sector has benefited. It now houses more households than the social rented sector. Private sector rental levels in high-pressure areas have increased in response to demand. Housing benefit is no longer covering the cost of renting a modest property in most parts of England. The government will also increase the amount of social housing available over time to provide the most affordable housing to those who need it. This will include reviewing how to support councils to deliver greater numbers of council homes alongside housing associations. Home ownership has become increasingly difficult to access, particularly for first-time buyers, as house price growth has outstripped growth in wages. Median house prices in England were 9.1 times higher than median wages in 2021. The ratio varies substantially across the country, with prices over 20 times higher in residents' median earnings in some parts of London. The average UK tenant now spends more than 28% of their pay before tax on rent, figures shared with the BBC show. Average rents for new lets have also risen, jumping 10.4% in a year, making it harder for people to afford places. The pressure of rising mortgage rates faced by landlords, as well as higher demand for properties than the number made available, have combined to raise the costs for tenants. Affordable homes are provided for tenants who do not fit the criteria of the for-profit commercial housing sector. It excludes low-income families, those whose current living conditions have a negative impact on their health, overcrowded housing, homelessness through domestic abuse. Average full-time weekly earnings in England are £589 to £630 per week before taxable deductions. A person earning £30,000 a year is only likely to be provided with a mortgage of £120,000 by a bank. New build average house prices are £285,000. The average monthly mortgage payment is £740. Michael Gove. New developments should be beautiful, promote a sense of community, also have adequate infrastructure and respecting the environment. Quote, exciting scheme for the council, and unlike any major development in the country, it is driven by the council for the community, not by a developer for private profit. Contradiction. The removal of a Section 106 agreement is requested as the site is not viable if this condition is not removed completely. Discrimination. EBC officials have approved this application, so how can EBC vote against it? If the commercial developer cannot afford to build the private housing stock without making any profit, perhaps the whole planning application should be reviewed until affordable housing is guaranteed. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Kitty. Does anyone want to come back on that last one?
Yeah, I don't think there's any disagreement in terms of the sort of the overall comments. You know, we're all aware of the, you know, housing needs and the cost of housing, but the viability in this case and the facts of that lead to the conclusion, the recommendation that it simply can't be delivered with this site through Section 106 agreement. And the government also, as quoted, the government also does want developments to secure other infrastructure and other housing, and it obviously does deliver that. So it's very difficult, but we can't change the facts and the figures of that viability report.
Thank you, Dawn. We now have two people registered to speak in favour of the application. So can I ask Chris Payne, who's the Horton Heath Project Director? Yeah, sure. Lloyd Exley can go first. He's the Horton Heath Strategic Development Manager.
Thank you. Good evening, councillors. I just wanted to go back, I suppose, to May 2021, the original planning committee, and just remind you, there's only three things.
Just to explain, the total time given to those speaking in objection and in favour has to be the same. So we could time Lloyd, but he'd end up with quite a lot of minutes. So we thought pragmatically. But we can give him, he says he's going to only take three, and I believe
I should
him.
only be three, if that. So, sorry, so going back to May 21, original planning committee, when this planning committee voted to support the application, there are only three things under consideration tonight. The decision there was to support the application, and there were two major issues which the applicant and the planning department needed to resolve between themselves and come back here tonight, which is what we're doing. And there is one other matter which has changed in the intervening period, which is also being referred back. So there's only three things to consider. Highways, no objection. That issue is gone. The habitat regulations assessment, no objection. There is one objection on the New Forest recreational impact, as we've heard, and Eastleigh Borough Council, the planning department, as the competent authority, have satisfied themselves that what is proposed, the mitigation, is all acceptable. There is no harm. So that issue is resolved. And the last one is affordable housing. Now, we've heard, quite rightly, that in planning terms, the Cabinet decision is not a material planning consideration. But take it in its full context. This council, Cabinet, has decided to remove the affordable housing from the Section 106 in the planning process so that it can deliver it by another route. And by doing so, it can bring in grant funding from somewhere else into the borough that makes the entire development more viable and more practical. So, I accept in planning terms, it's a pretty dismal story. Affordable housing is being removed. That is not the situation. That is not the reality, and that's why the Cabinet report is referenced, whether or not it's a material planning consideration. and nothing else has changed. You know, the application that this committee voted to support back in May 21 is virtually unchanged, but some of the technical matters that were outstanding have now been addressed. So apologies if that seems really, really obvious, if I've just taught you all to suck eggs, but I just thought it was worth, you know, reiterating that point. And that was it. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Lloyd. And would Chris like to speak now?
Thank you, Chair, and good evening, members of the committee. I also don't intend to take many more minutes than are needed, but there is a lot of content that's come through, both in the spoken and written representations that have come through. Sitting there listening and taking notes, I think there really are two major issues of concern here. One is clearly the affordable housing, and the other is potentially the higher access standards, which have been referenced on a number of occasions. In terms of this development, it will be delivering through the Section 106 £155 million worth of infrastructure and other 106 financial obligations. That equates to £60,000 per dwelling across the whole site, and that is somewhere between 4 and 5 times the average across the borough of Eastleigh. This development is delivering a heck of a lot more than any other site in the borough. The full package of measures would include affordable housing. As a developer, Eastleigh Borough Council is offering a commitment to still deliver the affordable housing. It simply proposes to use a different legal instrument in order to do so. So, in terms of the viability, in terms of the affordable housing, I'd urge the committee to consider the alternative. This site is going to come forward by somebody. If it doesn't come forward by Eastleigh Borough Council, there'll be less of everything. There'll be less roads, there'll be less green infrastructure, there'll be less affordable housing. The alternative is far dimmer than has been presented here this evening. And I think that is a material consideration, as well as the concerns that it's not the planning instrument that secures the affordable housing. In terms of the DM29 policy for higher access standards, and it's that policy that brings in the requirements of Part M42 and Part M43 of the building regulations. Nothing that's been said here this evening is incorrect, but it does need some clarification. So there are some mandatory requirements of policy DM29. The development will meet all of those mandatory requirements, and that has never been in question. The target elements of DM29, the development will meet the vast majority of those elements. M43 relates to specialist housing. Those matters will come out in detail, future reserve matter applications. But again, whilst we're not giving a blanket undertaking to comply with the policy, there is an absolutely acutely an understood need that specialist housing needs to meet those much higher access standards. The area of non-compliance, if we can call it that, is around M42, and that's around adaptability for general needs housing going into the future. And the proposals and the house types that Eastleigh Borough Council have developed meet the vast majority of those requirements. It doesn't meet the requirement for 80% of all of the houses to have a bathroom on the ground floor that in the future could become a ground floor shower. And that is all that we're talking about in non-compliance terms. So, not arguing that the policy is not fully being met, I'm just asking you to consider the context of what it is that is not being fully met. To offset that, as the case officer has already said, the houses are much larger than nationally described standards and certainly much larger than private sector developers would deliver. So the adaptability intended through M42 and DM29 is ingrained into the proposals for this development. It's just delivered in a different way than the policy. I'm going to stop at that point, I think, because otherwise we're all going to be here much longer than we'd like to be, no doubt. I'd just like to recap with saying I would urge you to consider the alternative of somebody other than Eastleigh Borough Council delivering this project.
Thank you. Were there any comments on that? No. Everyone's shaking their head. In that case, I will open up to councillors for questions. Councillor Marsh.
I'm quite disappointed to be here tonight having these conversations. As a councillor for Eastleigh Borough Council, I'm disappointed in how Eastleigh is behaving. Part of the reason for that is how this has been rushed through. As a councillor, having to read 144 pages and then be sent supplementary bits and pieces all week, and 47 pages or whatever of presentation. I think councillors deserve to see documents in advance, quite significantly in advance, especially when it's a big consideration like that. So I would ask for things to be done slightly differently in future, not keep submitting additional supplementary information. But this issue surrounding affordable housing really bothers me. I know why it's being done, and I understand that we are being told that we're not taking out the affordable housing. The house is still going to be built. We're being told that the funding is going to be done differently for those houses. My question to Eastleigh Borough Council officers is, would we allow any other developer to do this to us? And because I genuinely believe the answer would be no. If any other developer was coming to us and saying, oops, sorry, no, we can't do it with Section 106, would we be proceeding, or do we want them to get their ducks in a row before they brought it to the planning application? So that's my concern, and I'd like that answered. Would we be allowing any other developer to do this? Because if we're saying yes, then this is the precedent we're setting.
Well, the short answer is yes. If the independent viability report tells us that the scheme is unviable to deliver affordable housing, and we're happy with that report, and we've used the same assessor for a number of years now, then yes, that is the situation. And I think, to be honest, you will see it more and more, because the evidence is there that with rising costs, falling house prices, I think you may have hit it on the nail. Developers won't even consider the development. They'll, and we will be in a situation where we don't have housing supply at all. But some will think they can still deliver it if affordable housing is removed or reduced. But yes, no, the process, allows it. In fact, DM28, policy DM28 allows it. It allows the viability process to take place, and it is important that you accept that is part of the planning consideration and planning process. It's we've been very successful in delivering it in the past, but that's in a different climate, into economic climate, and we have to recognise that this may happen again on other sites with other developers. Sorry, the other thing I should have said, of course, is your considerations is that you probably wouldn't get a developer saying hand on heart, I'll get grant funding and do it another way. But that isn't as I've said, it's not something you can put weight on today, but you have heard that today.
Chair, am I able to give a further clarification?
Advice is no, and we're going to do it by the book. Councillor Marsh.
Okay, so I accept that we will allow other developers to do this in future. So I accept that, then that's certainly something that committees will have to consider. But are Eastleigh Borough Council able to give us some kind of assurance that although the funding stream is being changed, that affordable houses will be built within this development, regardless of the funding? Or are we saying, oops, if we don't get the grant, sorry, no affordable housing in this at all?
I'll respond to that piece because it sits outside of the planning application. So we've got the Cabinet report from last week, which sets out the rationale and the process behind it. There is the commitment from the council to deliver affordable housing on this. And that commitment is clearly set out both today and what you've heard, but also through the Cabinet report. And through the conversations I've had with the Service Director for Finance and Strategic Housing, he is working very closely with Homes England and has already secured funding for the first few phases associated with this scheme. So we know that will be coming forward, and there will be a commitment to affordable housing on this site moving forward. I think as Ms Budden said, there is no guarantee that programme will remain in perpetuity there. However, we know this is a 10 to 12 year build-out programme. There's no indication that programme is likely to change. We will be probably the biggest provider of affordable housing in our borough, and so we're working very closely with Homes England in partnership as well as through recipients of grants. So there is that strong working relationship and commitment that will continue, and there's no foreseeable future where that will cease. But there is that underline which says, but we cannot guarantee it in perpetuity. We know that we can secure that land through the HRA, different HRA to what you've heard about, so the Housing Register account, which in effect sets us up as a registered provider, an affordable housing provider, and that land will be secured for affordable housing and the houses there on it, and any future changes to funding and how we might want to approach that and deliver affordable housing would be a matter that Cabinet would be involved in making future decisions on. So that assurances can be given to you up to that stage.
Thank you. Any more questions, Councillor Broomfield?
Thank you. Just very quickly, a point of clarification. A few months ago, we had a presentation about the plans, and I followed up with a visit to Sean, who I think is working on the road layout. And one of the things that was mentioned is that you're appointing it's may not actually be designed at you, I don't know who could answer this question, that a traffic specialist was being sought to sort of fine-tune the plan before it went to consultation. I'm just wondering if that person has been appointed, is in place yet?
That is a question for the applicant.
Yeah, I am itching to answer. Can I just clarify, you're talking about the Allington, Blackberry, Sandy Lane junction, or all of the off-site junctions?
Understanding was, I'm primarily interested in Allington Lane, Blackberry Drive, Sandy Lane,
Yeah.
but my understanding was it's pretty much the whole of the off-site infrastructure.
Yeah, so there are 8 key junctions off-site that we are undertaking to do works to, subject to the consent being granted. The biggest and most complicated one is the Allington, Blackberry, Sandy Lane Drive junction. The consultant specialist for that junction has been appointed. The main reason for that is it's one of the earliest off-site deliverables under the Section 106. Some of the others get picked up through the first phase of housing, particularly the ones on Burnett's Lane, and others don't need to be delivered until much later on in the 10 to 12-year build period. So the answer to your question relating to Allington Lane, Blackberry Drive is yes.
Thank you. Anyone else over there going to wave? No, I have some questions. The first relates to the objection from Natural England, which is of course around the new forest mitigation. What gives us the confidence that our approach to those SANGs is sufficient?
Okay, yes, thank you. Yes, so the whole new forest issue arose following some research done by a company called Footprint Ecology for Natural England, and they did surveys, and including telephone surveys of visitors to the New Forest, obviously. So we've used that evidence specifically for Eastleigh. So they obviously surveyed an awful lot of people who are visiting from a very wide area to the New Forest. But in terms of the Eastleigh area, then the survey information indicated that the number of visits from Eastleigh were about 20% of those compared with the visits from people who live closer to the forest within the 5-kilometre zone. So that sounds pretty obvious, but that was the stats. Natural England have a one-size-fits-all policy, so they want full 8 hectares per 1,000 population mitigation for alternative provision, SANG provision, irrespective of whether you're right next to the New Forest or like Horton Heath, a long drive away. And so we've used those figures and said, actually, look, they tell us that the visits are less the further away you live, which is pretty obvious, but that's so that's the basis for our approach, is that we're using that research that was commissioned by Natural England to justify a lower provision of hectares. So it's 2 hectares per 1,000 population that's being delivered, which is above, it's 25%, so there's a bit of precautionary element built in there, plus obviously funding for new forest ranges as well as monitoring. So yeah, I think there's various cabinet reports, but the one back in March 22 set out all the facts and figures, and yeah, we're confident that they're right. If anything, they still overestimate the number of visits. I mean, I think the thought that people from Horton Heath visit the New Forest twice a month or more is probably probably overestimating it anyway. But so we're confident that the figures that we've used, say in delivering that interim strategy, are robust. The strategy will be reviewed, as I've said, in time as well. So hopefully there'll be more survey information come to light as well, which supports that. Thank you.
Thank you. And then I have another question. Sorry, this is going to be a bit rambling. We've heard about the sensitive boundary with barley fields, and I agree with what Mr. Grant said, that I think it's a real shame we're in this position, and I absolutely sympathise. And I have raised before that I don't know if more could have been done to avoid it, but if more could have been done to avoid it, I would have wanted to see that. So we're not in a position that I'm particularly happy with, and I think the council as applicant needs to really make sure that that is picked up as quickly as possible. My question around this is, we have some parameter plans. They show potentially 3-storey, relatively close to that boundary. There's a contention that that may not be deliverable without having, say, an overly negative impact. That seems a reasonable contention. If we approve a 3-storey parameter plan, I suppose my question is, that's not going to be we're not going to be held to that later on and told, oh, well, you have to approve 3 stories because it was in the parameter plan. We're going to be able to say, no, the design doesn't meet what we think it needs to meet. You can only have 2 stories there.
Yeah, so when we get to the reserve matter stage, which is when as I've said, the detailed matters of layout and appearance and scale get considered, then obviously the parameter plan, and it is, as I've said, it was maximums, it wasn't absolutes, then that they will all be considered, but if it's obviously evident that that if I'd hope not, but if a 3-storey building's been proposed and it clearly has unacceptable impact on a neighbour, then the obvious thing would be that plan would be required to be changed. So yeah, I mean the parameter plan does give some progression of heights, but and it's very much, as I say, it's very much a detailed consideration. We're aware that levels change around the outside of the site into the Horton Heath site, so it's all those factors need to be taken into account. So that's why it's really important that you don't sort of jump to sort of a decision now, because you've got to look at it in terms of the scheme itself, the orientation of buildings, the design, the roof forms can make a massive difference in terms of impact. So all those things, site levels, and individual amenity. So we will do that. But yes, it's if it's obviously very obvious that 3-storey won't work, then that won't be acceptable. Yeah.
Right, thank you. And then I have one more question. Some concerns were raised, I think, about in one of the statements around how Hampshire had inspected the previous drainage. We're obviously requiring through this modification to the condition that's been proposed tonight to require verification that it was correctly installed, wasn't it? Is there any indication of typically who would be doing that verification?
Right. So the council itself doesn't have drainage engineers, so we rely on Hampshire County Council as a lead flood authority. They're the main body, as well as the Environment Agency where necessary. So they will check the plans, but they don't. Unfortunately, they don't do verification checks. That's just not part of what they do. So we would ask the developers, consultant engineer, not anybody, a qualified consultant engineer to do those verification checks. If we are concerned that I would say at that point, you would be able to see if the drainage isn't working because it would be installed and the verification would come after that. If we are concerned that it's not working, then I think at that point we would have to employ independent consultants ourselves to check the verification. So I think that will be the process that we would follow. But the initial, and we require verification on a number of things. It's not just drainage. Is for the consultant engineer who's, who ideally the one who's designed the scheme, so that they're very familiar with it. But if not, somebody independent who will check it first, and then we will. We'll still engage with Hampshire as flood authority, but our experience is that it's just not something that they as a matter of course do. We may be able to pay them to do it, I suppose, as well, but it's just the process, I'm afraid.
Okay, thank you. Any more questions? Obviously, if they occur to you later, you can still ask. In that case, we'll move into debate, and we have this process that we do where we ask for a proposer and a seconder of a motion. Would anyone like to propose? Councillor Tennant, are you proposing as written?
Yes.
Thank you. And a seconder? Councillor Couldry. In that case, we can go into debate. Is there any debate? Councillor Marsh.
Okay. I'm disappointed the Secretary of State hasn't called this one in, because he's certainly been given opportunity to buy Eastleigh Borough Council, but I understand that's probably because the current government has set up laws to encourage building in greenfields, which I wish they hadn't been doing. So I really would hope that, because people are concerned about Eastleigh being the developers, the planning authority and everything else, so it would be good if it was called in, but that option has been given to them, so that's just an observation. I wanted to comment about public art. I do hope that Biffa has put a lot, so the Bishop Stoke, Fair Oak, Horton Heath committee have put a lot of work into the public art strategy, and I hope, although there's mention of public art in here, I hope that the strategy for Horton Heath and Fair Oak and Bishop Stoke is absolutely considered when things progress. So that was another observation. I've got to the point where I find that the name of this development, One Horton Heath, quite farcical, and in fact this whole thing is ridiculous. I've just sat here tonight and heard the principal planning officer say this is not a suburb of Horton Heath, we're designing a new area. So why are we still calling it One Horton Heath? Because it has no resemblance to anything in Horton Heath. The fact that we're now looking at a development which originally we were talking 3-story development, now suddenly it's 4-story, I know and I fully understand the parameters means that it doesn't mean it's got to be 4-story development, but up to 4-story development. And then we've slipped in the 6-story building again, so we removed it from the beginning of the development, where there were no houses, and we've now moved it into the centre, and I understand that's not necessarily the things, but it's in this document that I'm reading, and it's so frustrating to see. I don't need a 6-story building to find my way or see where I'm going. At the moment, you drive down a hill and there's a great big field. I'm sure people will find their way without a 6-story monstrosity within this. I would love to know, we are meant to be considering the local area and what's around us. I'd love to know where in Fair Oak, Horton Heath, Hedge End, where are all these 4-story buildings in relation to One Horton Heath, possibly in Eastleigh, but I don't see them in what at the moment is a more semi-rural area, semi-rural, semi-urban. I don't quite know where it fits in planning terms, but I am concerned that 6-story building in One Horton Heath bears no resemblance to anything that we've spoken about so far. I'm very concerned by the fact that Natural England have objected, and when I read it, I understand what you're saying about New Forest, but it says further information on nitrogen neutrality, phosphorus sediments, drainage, air quality, etc., etc., etc. If Natural England are saying no, why are we proceeding at this stage? I'm concerned that in paragraph 100, Hampshire, and I think reference was made to it early, Minerals and Waste, said they're disappointed that mineral safeguarding advice has been disregarded. We meant to be doing this in a way that's landmark and doing it the best possible way we possibly can, and yet people are saying we're disappointed in what you're doing. I found it really quite shocking, and I can't say I really understand it. When looking at paragraph 161, Hampshire County Council has public health raises no concerns, despite the fact that we're not able to put doctors' surgeries and things into it. So I'm not sure why they're not raising any concerns. How on earth can the EIA say that health impacts are considered to be neutral? We can't get into doctors' surgeries now, and I understand that these aren't necessarily material considerations. But why isn't more being done? I know that doesn't lie with Eastleigh exclusively, but I think residents need some explanations, because we're being told that the clinical commissioning group want a contribution to further develop Stokewood surgery, which is good. I understand that they say we can't have another doctor's surgery within Horton Heath, but how can it have a neutral impact when we can't get a doctor's appointment now before these 6,000 additional people move into our area? I'm very worried about what we are now setting ourselves up for, because I understand that lots of this, and and credit to the officers, I appreciate how much work has gone into this application, a great deal of work, and I don't want to underestimate or undermine that, because a lot of work has gone into this, but actually there's some things that we could do so much better with. Thank you.
Thank you. Any more debate? Councillor Tennant.
Yeah, this is a very big application, and it affects everyone in Eastleigh. There are some things that I've been very concerned about from the get-go. One was the name of the new development. It was called 1 Horton Heath, I believe, because we wanted to make sure that all of the residents of Horton Heath, so that's existing residents of Horton Heath, weren't left out and weren't forgotten about. So I've been working really hard behind the scenes to try to make sure that the existing Horton Heath residents don't lose out. One aspect I've been looking at is broadband and mobile telephony. So I've been bringing this subject up at lots of meetings, and I'm aware that apart from the £155 million in developers' contributions, that will possibly be available, that this hasn't been planned into the to the scheme. But it doesn't stop us speaking to the likes of Openreach and Vodafone to make sure that people in the older part of Horton Heath have the same facilities as the people in the newer part of Horton Heath. So I'm very positive about what I've heard this evening about the £155 million, because I expect that to be available to the existing Horton Heath. I would not like to see the residents living in Horton Heath to feel like second-class citizens once this new development is complete. The other thing that I am concerned about, which is it's not entirely specific to this development, but it's a situation that we have with government at the moment, in as much as that I've been trying to find out over a period, and I think I've got the answer now, that it is not, government do not have to supply a certain number of GPs for a large-scale development. And so that means that whenever a development happens, yes, it will make access to our own GPs more difficult, because there'll be more houses, more people. And I think that is the wrong policy from government. The government should be, they should tide planning applications and the number of houses that are built in with the supply of GPs. I also concur with the comments made by Councillor Marsh with respect to this, that the natural reaction is to say, well, we should have more GP surgeries. Well, it depends. It's not for us to make that comment because it's a how can I say, non-government, well, it is a governmental organisation, it's a Quango. It was the CCG and it's now the ICB that make those decisions, and they are funded directly by government. So if they say that they don't want more surgeries because they haven't got the staff to staff them, then we've got no more say over that. And in any case, the developers, the Section 106 would only fund bricks and mortar and not the resources of GPs. So setting that aside, I can see that's going to be a problem for all future, all future planning applications in the near future, that we're going to be building more houses because we need them, but we'll have a diluted access to our GPs, and that's for government to sort out. I've got many problems to sort out, and that's just another one of them. But for the moment, something that is in our control is that we can do the best possible for the residents of Horton Heath to bring their standards of life up with those that we're going to be giving this new development. So, as many people here are aware that I'm also a Fair Oak and Horton Heath parish councillor, and I think it's completely unacceptable that they only have 1 megabit per second broadband access. They're trying to run a service there with minimal broadband access, and I'm hoping that of this £155 million that we've got, or the influence that we have, that the parish council and other businesses within Horton Heath will have proper broadband access. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Councillor Tennant. Anyone else waving? Councillor Broomfield.
Thank you. It's nice to know that when the residents of Fair Oak and Horton Heath can't get their cars out of the drive because of the extra traffic through the village, that at least they can sit at home and play on the internet. Now, I'm going to take points in order. The first one, traffic. Now, if you look at page 44, paragraph 99, that's Hampshire Highways. And the reason I asked my question was quite straightforward. If you look at bullet point 5, implementation of the Allington Lane Fair Oak Road Priority Junction, etc., works to be completed prior to 200 occupations. Now, given that we're expecting the first occupations to take place in a year's time, then we have the Winchester Road, this is bullet point 7, Winchester Road Sandy Lane Priority Junction works to be completed prior to 600 occupations, which gives us a bit of time. Now, when I spoke to Sean, the plan is sketched out. Obviously, he was waiting for the consultant. Now the consultant's in place, so that's good news. But the sort of timescale he was talking about makes me doubtful that the work through Allington Lane, Fair Oak Road, Sandy Lane, Blackberry Road is going to be ready in time for 200 occupations to be complete. So that's something I would raise as a bit of a concern. Then we look at, going back slightly to page 43, paragraph 93, which is the police. Now, we know that it's already been discussed that this development, a lot of the housing looks like it's a form of the Radburn housing system, which has its critics, shall we say. And Hampshire Police, talking about public safety, suggests that collectively these attributes are generally referred to as the crime prevention through environment design, CPTED, principles, and can be delivered through the Secured by Design award scheme for which conditions are recommended. So again, I think that would be very helpful. Public safety is a great concern, and the fear of crime is often far greater than crime itself. I think we should consider that more. And then we come on to Councillor Parker-Jones' comments about Natural England. And I think Councillor Parker-Jones very carefully answered Councillor Tidgeridge's question about why Bishopstoke councillors aren't on this committee. Now, Natural England, if we look at page 105, we're told that, sorry, bullet point 105. No, it's not bullet point. Bear with me a moment. It is 108. Bullet point 108 on page 46, Natural England's objection. Now, we've been told regularly through this that their concerns are mostly around the New Forest mitigation. But if you look at that paragraph, it's one of the longest paragraphs in the report as far as I can see, and as Councillor Marsh pointed out, there are lots of other things besides the New Forest. So again, it concerns me greatly that we're, it seems, not taking full care of all these. Now, Lloyd Exley did say that EBC have satisfied themselves. Well, that's nice, but also it then answers Keir Wingrove's point about whether Eastleigh should be the planners, the builders, the permission givers and all the rest of it. Because if Eastleigh have satisfied themselves, I'd rather they were satisfying Natural England, to be perfectly honest. And then finally, and this is the thing that really gets me, is this scheme from the beginning has been, I think the word difficult is one that I would use. And I remember the first time I think I went to a presentation after I was elected, one of the people making the presentation said it was very apparent from the beginning that Eastleigh Borough Council had bitten off more than they can chew, but that they were now bringing it round and making it work. Are they? I mean, being a cynic, it seems remarkably fortunate, coincidental possibly, that a week ago Cabinet changed the rules regarding provision of affordable housing. Now, why did they do that? Well, I can only assume it's because they're running out of money to build affordable houses. I know that they're expecting to get £50,000 per affordable unit from Homes England, but nothing's been signed, sealed, let alone delivered on this. And although, yes, we might be 99% certain the money's going to turn up, I do wonder whether we would be giving planning consent to somebody on the basis that they're pretty confident of getting £50,000 a unit at some point in the future. So again, most of these changes, I have to say, look to me more designed to be saving money than providing any particular benefit to the population. And the final point I would make comes back to Barley Fields. You know, I've been to Barley Fields, several of you already have, I'm sure. The last time I went, I was shown some computer-generated sketches of what might be expected looking back towards Chalcroft Farm. And at the moment, as you know, they've got lovely open fields with, it's a beautiful scenic view. It's a lovely place. The plans looked like either the gable ends of terraced housing or, better still, something like a particularly Stalinist barrack block. Now, we know that there are the known unknowns and the unknown unknowns. This is very much a known unknown. The residents of Barley Fields know that they're in for something, they just don't know what it is. And to reinforce the chairman's comments, I really think that as a matter of priority, some form of reassurance should be given to the Barley Fields residents. It really isn't acceptable in this day and age. You know, this takes us back to the railway clearances of the East End, as in Dombey and Son. You know, you cannot live your life not knowing at some point in the next 10 to 15 years what on earth is going to be at the end of your garden. I think Barley Fields, as a special case, very much need that reassurance, and I think everything should be done to give them it. So on that basis, those are my comments, and well, I'll pass it over to you. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm going to ask Dawn to just clarify the nature of the Natural England objection, just so that we're all clear.
Yeah, I should apologise. So the first part of the text of their comments was when they first commented. So when they first objected, they wanted more information on all those matters. They did receive that. So we ended up with, as I've said, primarily the New Forest mitigation. They had a minor issue around water quality, which was around the monitoring document, which they have since signed off on the first residential phase. So, yeah, the process over those intervening months addressed those comments that were in the first part of paragraph 108. So apologies for that. I should have made that clearer in the report.
Thank you. I've got Councillor Tennant and then Councillor Marsh.
Yeah, I'd like to to ask, just based on what Dawn's just said, I'd like to ask for a further confirmation on that Natural England objection. So the first part of the first sentence talks about nitrate neutrality and further information required. What was that further information required?
So they wanted to see more about the strategy for delivering in the end it was nutrients, so it's both nitrates and phosphates, neutrality. So the applicants provided more information about on-site provision of wetlands as well as off-site credits as necessary. We refined and put more detail in section 106 on that basis. So yeah, it was just initially there wasn't enough information to satisfy Natural England, and that's absolutely fine. We provided that information, which was also provided through the appropriate assessment. So there's a lot of information now, whereas there wasn't initially.
Thank you. Councillor Marsh.
I wanted to pick up where Councillor Broomfield, left off with Barley Fields, and I absolutely agree with what Mr. Grant said and about the residents getting due consideration. And I know it's been spoken about, but they're not getting enough information quickly enough. But actually, there's another group that I want to bat for, because I just feel like every committee I've ever sat at, we talk about Burnett's Lane residents and Barleyfield residents, and I'm not trying to be dismissive of you at all, quite the opposite. I think they've done a sterling job in trying to fight their corner. What worries me is Bramley Gardens and Angelica Gardens don't have their residents forming an association and fighting for their corner. And actually they as badly or almost as badly affected as Barley Fields are, and I think we should be giving them due consideration as well. And actually I visited the lady who has a lovely new electric pylon in her back garden because of the lack of due consideration that we gave. And again, we can do it better, and if we think about things early, then mistakes like that won't be made. So I think we do need to be thinking very clearly about all of these residents, and as each phase comes up, we need to have real detail on how we're going to screen, how we're going to protect, so that they're not dealing with things like a pylon in their back garden. Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Couldry.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm very conscious of the fact that the decision is limited to the 3 or 4 factors that the applicants outlined in their presentation, but I want to take it more broadly, because I do think it is a much more broad question. There seem to me some very important questions, and the most important of which is the question of social housing. When I first saw this, I misunderstood the reason for taking away the social housing out of the Section 106 agreement. And the fact is that we can't deliver this with social housing inside the Section 106 agreement and all the other things that are delivered in the Section 106 agreement, which include better standards of building, better standards of space, better ecology, and all these nice-to-haves, which may not be absolutely essential. But we want to make a decent place for people to live, and so we need those. And the Cabinet, who, as Councillor Broomfield has quite rightly pointed out, actually reorganised the social housing in order to provide it in a different way and got it rushed in just before this meeting. Yes, I accept that. But the Cabinet has found a different way of doing it. Now, it is not risk-free. We must all understand that. The fact is that this depends on grants, which could be withdrawn by the government. And we've got to then have a choice between taking that risk or completely sending it back and getting the social housing back into the Section 106 agreement and taking everything out. So we can probably get all the nice-to-haves, all the things we actually want, and the social housing by making this decision to go forward in accordance with the resolution. Or we can say, no, we're not going to prepare to take a risk that these grants will be withdrawn. And then you've got to consider the level of risk. This is a very conservative, right-wing government that provides this money for housing, basically because it has to, because it is politically unacceptable to do anything else. Is this government, or any government, going to actually withdraw these grants? They might change the system, they might do something different, but there will always be, as a political imperative, this sort of support for public housing. It's not enough. I don't think it's enough now, and it's certainly not enough for the future. But to think that that the risk is a great one, or even material, it's certainly not significant. And so I am very much in favour of this change of providing social housing through the housing revenue account and taking all those gains, those environmental gains, those better housing gains that are contained in the Section 106 agreement. Now, the next thing that I'm really very worried about is the environmental element. Now, there are two elements here. There's first of all the New Forest objection. Now, the New Forest objection was actually dealt with in Cabinet quite a long time ago, some months ago. And basically what the New Forest is demanding is money is spent by it. And our response is to say, well, why don't we do it here? That's the sort of long and the short of it. It's technically not quite right, but we're doing quite a lot of mitigation here. And as we can, and I prefer to spend money here than money elsewhere, I think I'm perfectly happy to go with the Cabinet on that one. So, flooding. Flooding has been, let's face it, it's been a cock-up somewhere, but I don't know where. I know it's subject to litigation, and we're not going to be able to solve it here. But we do need to do as much as we can in the way of checking that it doesn't happen again. I think this amendment that's been proposed is satisfactory. I don't know anything else. I don't know anything about flooding engineering. I'm not an engineer, and so I just can't do anything technical to add to it. But it is very important that we do take this very seriously, and that we are very, very that the applicant takes complete, it does everything it possibly can to deal with that issue. But that's actually all that we can do. Now, Councillor Broomfield expressed some doubts about the traffic arrangements being made on time. Can I just say, Councillor Broomfield has experience to support him, because we're always seeing this, that traffic comes in late. I don't know what we can do about it. Are there conditions that we can impose to make sure that these traffic changes are made before, these conditions that the 600 houses occupied, we have all these traffic changes in? I mean, if the condition's there, will it be enforced? It's a difficult one, because you've got houses ready to stand and ready for occupation, and people need to go into them. To say no because a few commas haven't been, a few traffic lights haven't been put in or something, that's excessive. But it does. But he's right. We've really got to get going on this one. And he's also right, and indeed everybody here has accepted that the Barleyfield Residents Association is, the residents have been treated not well enough, basically. And I think that, I don't know that we can put any conditions in, because it is something it's a detailed planning application under which we'd actually consider this. But I think that the applicants should be in no doubt that the message from the councillors is this one's got to be cracked as soon as possible. And the final thing is the final criticism of this is that we're judge and jury in our own cause. Well, I'm afraid that's the law. We have to. Every council up and down the country of whatever political persuasion is faced with that. Some people have suggested different ways of doing it, but the law is the law. We have to do what we are allowed to do and what we can do. And so, frankly, criticising this committee or the applicants or anyone for doing it this way is just silly. So there we are. It is a very complex, difficult application. Technically, I think everything is covered. So I will be supporting this application, not without any great belief that nothing will go wrong, because even I'm not that stupid. But it is a very ambitious, and as far as I can see, is going to be a very effective development that will provide much needed housing in this country, in this area, in an environment that is going to be as good as we can get. And so I will be supporting this application.
Thank you, Councillor Couldry. No one else has been waving. I have some thoughts. It won't surprise you to hear. I am going to agree and disagree with Councillor Couldry in a way that only the planning system can bring about. In the round, I completely agree with you about the delivery of affordable housing, but our decision tonight is not about the risk that it comes forward through an alternative scheme. It's about the plans that are presented in front of us, which is to say without affordable housing. And the planning question. Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. But we're here to deal with the planning question, which is simply, are these plans acceptable in planning terms? Not do we love them, are they perfect? Merely, are they acceptable given local and national policy? As bizarre and frustrating as the planning system is. So, we have rehearsed the arguments around council as developer versus applicant many times. As we've heard, it's not unusual. Councillor Marsh is correct to mention that it could have been called in at several points by the Secretary of State if they were particularly concerned. It hasn't been so far. A couple of other comments we've heard. I agree with respect to the boundary with Angelica Gardens and other roads along that boundary. I understand from the plans there is more buffer shown. They're not quite in the same position as Barley Fields, which is quite unique. But absolutely, those matters need very careful deliberation and consideration at the reserve matters stage, and I'm sure councillors, our debate tonight shows that we will give it that. With respect to density, I don't want to spend too long on discussion we had at our previous planning meeting on this application, but I mean, we can build up or we can build out. We have to get that balance right between density, stories on buildings, and actually taking up more land, which A, can then not be built on until the buildings we build are demolished, and B, takes away those fields, that habitat that actually we want to protect and we want to enhance. So that is a balance. I don't think the density proposed is wrong, albeit those caveats I have around some of the parameter plans and their proximity to some of the existing buildings. So it seems to me here tonight the main issue we haven't discussed previously at length is affordable housing, and it's just worth thinking about that. As we've heard, where affordable housing can be secured via Section 106, I think that's the right thing to do. But where developments are not commercially viable, the NPPF sets out that process for removing some Section 106 obligations, as does Eastleigh's local plan, as approved by the Planning Inspectorate, and that's what we're doing here. So that planning question we keep coming back to, in planning terms, I think this is acceptable. The viability assessment has been done, notwithstanding there's this other process outside of planning that we're not thinking about. The other major issue I think we have is this outstanding Natural England objection. Our previous delegation deliberately said that this application would come back if it was not resolved, because we thought that was the right scrutiny to give it, because it is important and it does need to be weighed up correctly. There are some people who would argue that Natural England is a quango that gets in the way of delivering houses, and I'm not going to advance quite that argument, but the legal authority for doing the habitats regulation assessment is with the council. We are the competent authority. From what I can see, a lot of work has gone into that assessment. The conclusions regarding the New Forest impact of sound, and we've had them explained to us tonight. I think it's reasonable to conclude that the SANGs we're putting in place will mitigate that impact on the New Forest. The other earlier objections from Natural England have been overcome. Councillor Marsh mentioned mineral safeguarding. My understanding is that safeguarding the minerals here effectively would make the site available for example, gravel extraction, which I don't think we would like. So actually, the sooner we build houses on top of it, the better in that regard. So I don't think the lack of mineral safeguarding is quite a reason not to feel in favour of this application, unless you like gravel. GP provision, I think, is worth picking up. Councillor Tennant mentioned it at length. My feeling on this is that I absolutely understand. I know it's difficult to get a GP. Often we give up, don't we, and hope it's not serious. And I'm young enough that that's an option for me. I appreciate that for many people that isn't, and that's awful. I get that. On the other hand, GPs can't be secured through a planning application. You can secure facilities, and we're making that contribution, but you can't secure actual GPs. GPs are people, they move around, they move into homes, and there are X number of GPs per capita. There's no reason to believe, in fact, that less GPs per capita will move into these homes than live anywhere else. So there will still be as many GPs as there are in the country. Some of them might have a nicer home. That is ultimately a problem for the government to tackle, and I appreciate they have failed, not least because I have a number of friends who are doctors who are currently on strike in lieu of emigrating, which is probably the next step. Councillor Broomfield mentioned that Cabinet seems to have changed the rules on affordable housing. I don't think that's quite right to say. The rules regarding Section 106 viability are set nationally. What I think Cabinet has done is put in mitigation for the non-viability we're considering tonight, but again, we're here to consider the plans in front of us, and I urge everyone to put that other scheme from their minds. So, we hear a lot about the negatives, and it's how the planning system works, and it's a great shame because for my entire lifetime we haven't built enough houses, and so many people feel that now because they can't rent, they can't buy, they can't start families, they don't have that security and comfort that a home would bring them. So absolutely right that we hear those existing concerns, but we don't hear from the underhoused or the people who can't afford in these debates, and I just want to remind everyone that these plans, this building of houses is not wholly negative. Like, it is a worthwhile endeavour to deliver homes for people. So there are huge benefits to getting this development built, even without affordable housing secured via Section 106. It is 2,500 households who conform, who currently can't. That's 2,500 households that will get the security and the safety of having a home. And I think that's a brilliant thing. It's not something that we should look on universally negatively, as is so often the case in planning debates and when we see them reported. It's too often overlooked. So, with all that in mind, I think on balance, I think these plans are, in the round, positive, as I did the first time we considered them, notwithstanding that I completely accept they are less positive with the removal of that affordable housing. But to my original point, are they acceptable in planning terms? I conclude that they are, and I will be supporting them. Thank you. Any more debate, Councillor Marsh?
I'm sure it won't surprise you to hear that I'm still hung up on the six-storey building that got snuck back into this document. It's a question, really, that I want to ask, because I do have an issue with the building height parameters, and I understand it's up to, and it doesn't necessarily mean it will be, but the chances are it will be. So I want to know if this application is accepted as we've read it tonight. That means that the six-storey building is a done deal. Or does it mean that at a later stage we'll get to discuss that six-storey building and determine whether that's being eliminated from this plan or not?
I think I know the answer, but I will let Dawn explain.
I think first, a point of clarification, the six-storey building hasn't been snuck back in. It's always been in right from the start, and it was only the southern and the northern gateway buildings that were changed, the building, and it may not be flats, it may be a public art structure of that height, within the local centre has always been in the plans and has not been reintroduced. It was never taken out. So just that point of clarification that it, you know, there's no change in that respect in terms of the building heights plan. And again, the comment is similar to the Barley Fields, is that, you know, the detail of that will be considered at the right time at the Reserve Matters application for the local centre, when you have all the information, detailed information in front of you. Thank you.
Thank you. Any more debate, Councillor Marsh?
Yeah, I'd like to come back about that. It might not have been snuck back in then, but certainly it wasn't common public knowledge. So maybe the applicants and planners knew about it, but actually residents and councillors celebrated when the first lot of we thought we'd eliminated that element, and we didn't necessarily know that there was a second one in the local area. Yeah, I don't know if anyone else was aware of it. I certainly wasn't, and I was in all the forums, so I wasn't aware that there was going to be. But again, can I just ask you, appreciate you said the fine details will be determined later, so you are saying that at a later stage, councillors will have the right to say, we don't want 6 stories.
I think I think that the building heights parameter plan will be an important consideration. Will be an approved plan, so you'd have to have good, sound reason to justify that a taller building isn't appropriate in that site. So again, that will come down to the relevant material considerations for that application at that time. I can't sit here and say no. You'll be able to strike it out. It may work perfectly well, and therefore be acceptable.
Thank you. Any more? No one's waving. In that case, we'll go to a vote. We have a proposal which is, as the recommendation was printed, which is up there on the screen, which is to grant outline permission subject to the recommended conditions, completion of the Section 106 legal agreement, and completion of the EIA notification processes. Can I see all those in favour, please? All those against? And no abstentions. So that motion as printed is passed. I suspect we may need another quick break. Does anyone want one? Yes, we'll take a 3-minute break then. Right, we're all back, so we will begin. On to item 7 then, which is planning application for land west of Burnet's Lane. And I'm going to ask Dawn to present this one as well.
Yes, thank you, Chair. So yes, this second application is it's not one you often see, but it's an application to vary the terms of an assigned Section 106 agreement. In this case, for the Lower Acre, so the first residential parcel of the Horton Heath site. We treat it similar to a planning application, so sort of give it a reference and do public consultation on it and other consultation. But the application is purely to remove the affordable housing requirement, as you may expect, from this first residential parcel. So that is the part of the site there, edged in red, so the bottom of the Horton Heath site. So the affordable housing provisions are in Schedule 5 of the agreement which was signed last December, and the consideration is the same. So we've had, in parallel with the outline planning application, we've had a independent viability report submitted for the first residential parcel 2, for the same reasons, high costs and other pressures. I have to say that for that first residential parcel, it's per dwelling, it's even more unviable than the overall outline, because of some of the infrastructure costs are coming very early, particularly the road work. So it's very expensive for that first phase when looking at it in isolation. Again, the advice is, is you've got to look at the facts and figures. If you accept those, then you shouldn't be refusing to in this case, refusing the variation. So you should be agreeing to it if you're happy that the facts and figures are correct. And the advice to you is that is the case. So, and my just final note there is, and we've talked about it a lot tonight, and really perhaps too much because it isn't a material consideration, but there is the intention of that Cabinet report to deliver on this phase as well as the rest of the site in a different way. So, because it's a recent application, we do have some report updates. So we've had 2 objections. We had one coming today. It was the one that was read out to you earlier on today by Kitty. So it's been actually formally submitted for this application alongside one other one, and on the grounds that the housing will be too expensive without subsidy, and it should be guaranteed through Section 106. Fair comment. In terms of consultation responses, yes, they're up on the screen. So we've had all our formal consultees respond now. Slight sort of addition is that Hampshire County Council, in sort of not objecting to this change, but they've noticed that they put the wrong figure in for their highways contribution sum and have asked, whilst we're varying the agreement, that we do that as well. They double counted on one of the off-site highway works. So I don't think that's a problem. We can do that. And we've had no objections from any other consultees. So the recommendation is, as per the report, because of the timescales, we've got another week to run on consultation, just the neighbour consultation. The decision will need to be delegated delegated to the Service Director, Planning and Environment, in consultation with the Chair and Vice Chair, and to consider any new or additional comments that come from neighbours. So obviously if it's the same comment, then that's already been considered, but if it's something new, then that would need consideration through that process, and to also correct that highways contribution sum. Thank you.
Thank you, Dawn. We have some members of the public registered to speak on this one. You will all get 3 minutes. Can I ask Councillor Louise Parker-Jones?
Oh, I love it when the lights come on. So it's not really going to surprise you what I'm going to say. What on earth is Eastleigh Borough Council thinking? 6 months ago, it was fine to sign this off as being absolutely appropriate to have affordable housing. We've actually heard from the chair this evening how important it is that people locally, our friends, our families, our neighbours, our residents can access affordable housing. And yet again, it's being removed. I think this sends an absolutely terrible message to developers. I think the decision you took earlier sends a terrible message to developers. It says that we will accept applications with zero affordable housing. I want you to turn this down, and I want those affordable houses in. It sets a nasty tone to the whole of the development by knowing those first houses are unaffordable and highly unlikely to be able to be bought by anybody I know. Anybody I know. They cannot afford to live here. They will have to move away. That's the reality of this. We will become a giant suburb of London where the people who earn the most and can commute will live and reside. I think it's really sad. And I think that you should reject this and you should stand by your guns and say, no, we put this in not that long ago and we signed it off. So if we can't do this, what else can Eastleigh not afford to do? Are we heading towards bankruptcy? Are we going to see all our services cut? Everything gone? And all we are is a glorified development company. I think it's a shame. And I don't think it reflects well on us. And I don't think it reflects well on members to rely on government to give us this money. Because that money still comes from the public. It still comes from the public. There is no other way of cutting this up. It's the same public purse. So I am disappointed. Please reject this recommendation, show that we can deliver and that we're competent and a capable authority. Otherwise, we're saying we're not. Thanks, that's all I want to say.
Thank you, Lou. Councillor Tidridge.
Thank you. I'd like to start off by talking about the pink elephant paradox. The pink elephant paradox is when you're told to not think about a pink elephant, and I can guarantee that everybody is now thinking of a pink elephant. I think this is the danger of bringing up something which is not a material consideration to a planning decision and expecting people to listen to it and then not consider it as part of their decision. That, to me, is really dangerous, and this committee has taken a decision with that in mind. I'm really concerned about the lack of affordable housing. My heart sinks when I see marketing material for new housing talking about executive, prestige, exclusive. It's not what this area needs, especially if we're talking about Horton Heath having a sense of place. A sense of place will be challenged if we're talking about unaffordable housing, which is effectively what we're talking about doing here. Turning a development which had a 35% affordable housing into, under the rules of planning, and the decision you're taking can only be based on the rules of planning, not on non-material considerations, as being zero affordable housing. That's the decision you're facing. Again, I'd like you to look at the viability assessment. Page 40 of the viability assessment for this site actually states that regardless of what you do, this development is still unviable. And I'd just like to read a little section from it. Both sets of appraisals demonstrate that the scheme is fundamentally unviable and cannot deliver any of the affordable housing required by the local planning policy. The main reasons for this are due to the substantial infrastructure and non-housing Section 106 costs that were required for FRP and the wider OPA site. That doesn't sound like the council has got itself into a particularly positive position from my perspective. Obviously, I could be wrong. And that I find really, really concerning, that we're committed to doing something which is unviable. And that's even before today's announcements from the Bank of England with interest rates. Obviously, the gift of foresight would be amazing. We don't have that. But in today's climate, we know that people are struggling to afford their rent. They're struggling to afford their mortgages, particularly if they're in the position of having to remortgage now. Making a decision to change this application as recommended will not help with that. And again, please don't think about pink elephants. Thank you.
Thank you, Jen. We have one person registered to speak in favour who should get up to 6 minutes because that's the total we allowed, but I only have a 5-minute button, so I'll add another minute if we need it, but it's a limit, not target. Yes, and that's you, Chris.
I'll try not to take 5, Chair. I don't know how you can not think about pink elephants, to be honest, because I still am. I think we need to bring it back to the planning policy, the national planning policy framework, and the rules of the game. The rules of the game quite simply say, if the market could not deliver this, it doesn't have to. The market could not and would not deliver the first residential phase at Horton Heath or any affordable housing. Not only that, it wouldn't deliver on the infrastructure or the green infrastructure that we're going with. It wouldn't deliver on the biodiversity net gain. But you would still get the houses. Is it material or not? I'm not even going to go there. But again, I urge you to consider the alternative. If Eastleigh doesn't bring this forward, what you will get instead is significantly worse. The viability process itself is a very blunt instrument. It's very less than perfect. And slightly sideways point, but Councillor Marst asked, would we allow this with any other developer? And actually, from a planning legal point of view, yes, you would. You probably would have no choice, but you actually couldn't allow this arrangement with anyone else because only Eastleigh Borough Council has the ability to secure affordable housing in a HRA. Once it's in the HRA, it can only come out with Cabinet approval and Secretary of State approval. So this is as robust as it being in the Section 106. Taking it out of the Section 106 helps deliver on all the other additional benefits.
Thank you. In that case, I'll open this up to councillors for questions. Are there any questions? No. In that case, can I ask for a proposer and a seconder? Councillor Tennant, Councillor Couldry, and we move into the debate. Is there any debate? Councillor Marsh.
I just wanted to say it's really disappointing to be in the room discussing an application that the consultation hasn't even finished for. Because it does feel, again, and I said it earlier and I'm saying it again, it feels like we're rushing this through. And at the very least, we should have, if we were doing a consultation until the 30th of June, we shouldn't really be discussing this until we'd had all of the responses. Because it now feels that it's rather immaterial what anyone says, because we're going to make a decision regardless of what they think until the 30th of June. So I just wanted to make an observation that in future, can we make sure the consultations are complete before we get to the planning application stage?
Any more debate? Councillor Couldry.
I haven't heard of the pink elephant test before, but it is apposite. If this resolution is prepared in the context of a new background, and the new background is the Cabinet's decision to provide 35% housing, affordable housing, through the HRA. And this means that we get in Eastleigh, out of taxpayers' money, yes, but it's all taxpayers' money, but out of taxpayer money we're going to get more housing, better housing, and a better deal for these, for the people of Horton Heath and the people who will come and join us in the area. This is a win-win. We've just got to do it. Thank you.
Thank you. With the caveat that, again, this decision is solely on the application in front of us. And we are simply taking the decision, as far as I can see, whether we believe the viability assessment. Because if we believe the viability assessment, the rules are pretty mechanical, which is that we can't insist on affordable housing in the Section 106. And any other developer, if we disagreed, would have a route to appeal that. The thing we don't talk about, actually, the novelty of council being applicant and developer, is the more complex, if possibly non-existent, ability to appeal our decision, which is not in our favour in some respects. So we are taking a decision tonight on whether we believe that viability assessment, and hence whether it is acceptable in planning terms to remove the affordable housing requirement from the Section 106. As far as I can see, the arguments are essentially a subset of what we just discussed, so I don't really have any new points. If anyone else does, wave now. Councillor Marsh.
When we're talking about the viability assessment, I guess when you pay for a private assessment, you get what you pay for. And I'm assuming Eastleigh had to pay for this viability assessment. And I think there was a really valid point made earlier that we went from 35% to 0. It would have been really interesting to see what 10% would have been, or 15%, or anything else. And it's just my observation, although I know it's not a material consideration tonight.
It is not a material consideration. But, hypothetically, if we did have a proposal in front of us that proposed 10% affordable, the funding from Homes England for the alternative scheme that we're not talking about wouldn't be available. Councillor Broomfield.
Thank you. I won't take your time for long. I listened to Councillor Parker-Jones and Councillor Tidridge and agree with them. The only thing I wonder, it's a rhetorical question really, is how many other nice things are going to have to be cut out of one Horton Heath. It certainly seems like we're hitting the, if I say hitting the buffers, it's probably an overstatement, but I think we are certainly, it becomes apparent that they're moving into some financial problems. And I just wonder where that's going to end up. Thank you.
Absolutely, but though the broader commercials clearly are not for this committee, which is the planning committee. So, no one else is waving, in which case we move to the vote on the recommendation. Is that the recommendation? That's the recommendation. It's quite long. I'm not going to read it. You can all read it, and you've read it. All those in favour as a recommendation as printed? Thank you. All those against? Thank you. And there are no abstentions. In that case, we move on to the end of the meeting. So that is the end. Obviously, this is an irregular meeting, so we don't have our next date, but I hope you will join us whenever that is. So I take the opportunity to thank you for attending, for listening, and for making the points that you did, and wish you a pleasant journey home.